I wanted to first introduce Nada, who works here at Open Gov Hub, who wanted to talk a little bit about the space that you are also in.
I'll stand just to see everyone. Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Nada, and I'm the manager here at the Open Gov Hub. I just wanted to quickly welcome you to the space and just give a little context if anyone isn't familiar. So the Open Gov Hub is a co-working community and a network of about 35 different organizations who are all working on open government reforms all around the world. The hub was established back in 2012 with just a couple of groups, but we've since expanded. And so, like I said, we have about 35 different organizations and about 200 people who call this physical space their home. And the hub was really set up basically for two reasons. The first was to bring together this wide variety of diverse but like-minded kind of individuals and organizations who wanted to focus on transparency and accountability and civic engagement, those kinds of issues, so that they could share resources. But the second reason the hub exists is really to be the center for collaborating and learning together, ultimately to have greater impact on these types of reforms. And so on a regular basis, we convene all sorts of different meetings and events and hackathons and everything in between here in this space. And just want to invite you all to learn more about us, check out our website. If you're interested in membership, we have a few new membership options as well. So if you're interested in these kinds of issues, definitely please be in touch and welcome.
Yeah, and if you're interested, we can put you in touch via email. Yeah.
Probably in more than expecting questions already. If I may, just can you define in just a sentence or two? You said open government reforms.
Sure.
I mean,
yeah.
Give me a sentence or two.
Yeah, of course. So basically, you know, the hub was established deliberately taking this kind of big tent or broad definition to open government issues, because the whole point was to get different people who maybe historically didn't work together but who shared this interest. So really, like I said, I think it boils down to 3 or 4 types of work. Work around transparency and access to information. So basically just opening up information about what governments are doing. Work around accountability and anti-corruption. So not just publishing information about what's happening, but really holding power accountable. Work around citizen engagement, so getting normal people to have a influence on public decisions that affect their lives. And finally, a kind of new theme, I would say, is specifically work around open data and technology. So how can we make sense of all of this new information that is coming online to make better policy decisions? So yeah, it's a pretty broad scope, but we have all sorts of groups working in those different areas.
Only one more at the risk of high governance. Is it only American governments, state, federal, local, or international?
Sorry. That's not that very much.
Oh, and I think our stragglers are also coming in.
So that was. Is it also other?
Yeah, just quick clarification. Yeah, so it's actually almost all of our members are nonprofit organizations who are working to kind of influence these issues. So we you know, and are working with governments in different ways, locally and globally. Most of our members are kind of international development organizations.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, that was actually perfect timing, and it's a very good transition, because I think this question about what think tanks do also gets these questions about accountability, transparency, so I think we'll get into that. But before we start, I wanted to do a very brief introduction of our speakers. To my immediate right is Dr. Maria Steffen, who is a senior policy fellow at the U.S. Institute for Peace, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She works on issues of civil resistance and nonviolent movements around the world. She's also worked in government and civil society, but I'm not going to give exhaustive bios here. Next to her is Dr. Andrew Selee, who's the Executive Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson Center. He's also the Senior Advisor to the Mexico Institute, someone who's been working, pretty much dedicated his entire life to working on U.S.-Mexico issues. And then
Build a wall.
And we like to keep things light here, as you can tell. So, and then to his right is Peter Apps, who's the Executive Director and founder of PS21, which is the event, the organizing, the organization that organized this event. And he's also been a longtime journalist with Reuters. He's been working on issues of defense and international affairs. And very briefly, my name is Negar Razavi, and I'm an anthropologist who studies think tanks. So it's very apt that I be moderating this. And I'm going to try to not interject too much of my own opinions on this, but as I told people earlier, you'll see from my facial expressions and some of my questions how I feel about some of my subjects.
We are her subject.
Yeah, exactly. Every single one of them is a subject in my research. So with that, I just want to give a brief introduction. So according to the, I had to look this up because it's pretty incredible. According to the 2015 Penn Global Go-To Think Tank Index report, there are 1,835 think tanks in the United States alone, by far the most of any country. I think second is China, and they're in the 400s. And 400 of those think tanks are based in DC. So what this event is really about is unpacking this pretty staggering statistic. What are think tanks, first of all? What role do they play? Why are there so many of them? What are they doing right? And what are they potentially doing wrong, or where can they be improving? Is there too much overlap? So with that, I'm going to start with Andrew, if you don't mind. You wrote a book called What Should Think Tanks Do? A Strategic Guide to Policy Impact, which is a great book. You should all read it. In it, you describe 3 roles that think tanks play. 1, framing ideas and issues. 2, providing policy alternatives. And 3, shaping decision makers. So can you talk about the different types of think tanks that exist in DC at the moment and how they sort of map onto these 3 categories? Giving specific examples of think tanks that you feel comfortable.
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, by the way, Negar. Thank you, and Peter. You know, I think think tanks, I was reading a book about the 1950s, actually, and the Dulles Brothers, a great book by Stephen Kinzer, last week. And it's really a great reminder of how they were active members of the Council on Foreign Relations back in the 50s. Very much part of the Washington establishment, even though they lived in New York for much of the time, but it was a Washington, New York axis. And it was a reminder of how much think tanks really at one point were part of an elite consensus around policy decision making, right? When the first think tanks came up, the Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, what eventually became Brookings and Carnegie, and then to some extent Randall, a different model. They were really about providing ideas for making specific decisions, right? It was people more or less shared a set of assumptions about how policy was made. People would be Democrats or Republicans and disagree on specifics, but it was really how do you get some sort of technical advice and some ideas as part of that elite consensus. You have in the 70s sort of a breakdown of that, right? You have the beginnings of particularly conservative think tanks that are really interested in how that you can, and then a reaction to sort of liberal and progressive think tanks. They're interested in how do you inject a different set of ideas, and you're part of the larger political conversation, very much tied to political parties, though not organically part of that. And then I think you begin to have, as the elite consensus breaks down, think tanks begin to play a much bigger role, less in, I would say they were sort of in that second category, sort of policy alternatives. You begin to have, with the conservative and later sort of the progressive and liberal think tanks, you begin to have an attempt to play on specific policy decision making. But as you know, the consensus breaks down, and you have more and more people, particularly with new technologies, who are involved in the conversation about policy, and whether it's healthcare policy or foreign policy with regards to the Middle East, or what, you know, choose your topic, immigration policy, whatever you want. You begin to have lots of voices. You actually have something of a democratization, actually, of policy discussions. I mean, we can agonize about it in Washington that there is, you know, there's no consensus anymore, and you know nothing's off the table. But the flip side of that is you actually have a lot more people involved in these conversations. And so increasingly, I think a lot of think tanks, you know, you've seen people move towards the third of these, which is really getting involved in policy decisions, or getting more politically engaged think tanks. But you've also seen a lot of think tanks, including the one where I work, the Wilson Center, but a lot of the other think tanks too, get involved in the framing of the conversation, right? I mean, it's much more sort of broad gauge. It's not just how do you know, change someone's mind. You're not just working with some specific office in the State Department or the Defense Department or a few offices in Capitol Hill, the 5 people that care about your issue, but you're actually working on the larger conversation. And so think tanks, I would say, both those in Washington, which obviously have privileged access to policymakers and still do some of the direct work with policy elites, I would say most of them either have to get their hands dirty really working in the trenches on policy decisions, or they have to go broader and actually think about how they engage with a larger national and international conversation on particular issues. And so I'd say those 3 still exist, but there's kind of been a branching out from just the sort of policy alternatives into real specifics and broad framing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One of the things that a lot of my students will come and ask me about is, you know, what's the difference between an academic center and a think tank? You know, why does it have to be this very unique, independent entity? And Maria, you've worked in academia, you've worked in civil society, and you've worked in government. Can you talk a little bit about what niche is the think tank playing or filling? What role is it filling that these other maybe academic institutions are not playing, or more activist-based civil society organizations are not playing?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're in an academic institute, your general goal is to get tenure. So you're going to write articles for academic journals to advance the conversation mainly within academic circles and advance your career in an academic setting. Your goal is tenure for the most part. Now, of course, different academic institutions increasingly are focusing on bridging the academic policy divide. In fact, there's Carnegie Corporation in New York is very, very focused on this issue of bridging the divide and sort of, you know, encouraging greater mixing between researchers and practitioners and policymakers. For think tankers, the central goal is to influence public policy. I mean, that's your primary purpose. And you're, you know, so you are writing things and presenting them in different ways. Your primary audience is not those reading academic journals. It's people reading op-eds. It's people reading policy blogs. It's people reading, you know, foreign policy, foreign affairs. So your audience is different. The way you present your research is different, and your goal is to shape public policy. And in a way, to use your research and analyses to support types of social mobilization around issues. You want to change something, which is not always the issue in academic institutions. I actually consider think tanks to be a type of CSO, albeit a different one, but you know, other CSOs that are maybe more focused on development or grassroots building, civil society organizations. Research may be part of their operations, but generally they're doing research to inform their operations and to advance very specific advocacy goals, whereas think tanks are very much in the business of producing, packaging, and disseminating information to influence policy. And think tanks specialize in this whole convening function. So they focus on mixing policymakers, practitioners, researchers. That's very central to their core mission. You find greater partnerships between researchers and policymakers at think tanks than you will ever find in academic institutions. So that mixing is just very central to operations. So I think those are some of the main differences.
Can I jump in there? Because I've been just thinking, I mean, I'm a Brit, as most of you have probably worked out, and the think tank dynamic in London is very different. I'll talk about history.
You anticipated my question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about history on the technical, really different as well. But I mean, the London think tank world is much, much smaller. So you've got, on foreign policy, 3 think tanks primarily. You've got the Royal Service Institute, founded by Duke Wellington, as far as I can remember. Chatham House, which is founded by a bunch of elitist kind of people who were doing various things in the 1920s and 30s in Chatham House, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. That's kind of it on the foreign policy space. In the domestic policy space, you've got a particular outfit called Demos, which fits much more the DC kind of approach. The way I look at think tanks in DC, I mean, as a journalist, I use them with things they contain people. Right? So almost an agricultural model looking at think tanks, but think tanks are where you put people when they're not in government. And you know, if your aim is tenure in an academic institution, your aim in which means you want to stay in a think tank, your aim is you want to go. So you know, you want to run the program in X institution until you get to become the undersecretary for whatever, and then you want to come back into the think tank and become someone even higher up in the think tanks. And I mean, you know, and my instinct is that the pay scale starts ratcheting out fairly dramatically once you've got a really decent former job, which is why one of the things that fascinates me about this town is that actually there are lots of jobs in government where it's quite hard to achieve anything, but afterwards you're the former undersecretary for whatever, and therefore your aim isn't necessarily even to become the undersecretary for whatever, it's to become the former undersecretary for whatever. Really, really, really fascinating. And that strikes me like utterly nuts. In the UK, there's much less of that track. So if you are Chatham House or IISS, you might be a former official, nice links to one of our global fellows, his next deputy chief of MI6 is now with IISS, but there's not a revolving door so much, except in that you might be an intern at 21, go into the civil service at 22, and then go back to a think tank at 65. I mean, that's the revolving door in London, and it's very different. My instinct, therefore, is that, you know, in the way, one of the ways in which DC shapes stuff is not so much that people read your policy document, it's that people claim to have read your policy document and then make you the undersecretary for the thing you read the policy document about. I mean, Peter Singer at New America managed to find a decent hack to this, which was to write a novel which everyone actually read. And one of the most revealing things about that is that people actually tell me they actually read it, which is fascinating and quite revealing, I think. Whereas, you know, the say Institute for Study of War on Syria, who've done really great stuff on Syria, people kind of look at the PDFs, but until they actually necessarily read them. You know, DC is a really, you know, it's kind of is kind of think tank central. The other thing I would say is that, I mean, I take your point on there being less consensus in think tanks, but from an outsider of any form, there are still massive overlaps. I mean, on foreign policy, everyone in DC in a think tank is a liberal interventionist or a neocon interventionist, which is so close to being the same thing that I'm not sure as an outsider I can tell the difference. You know, it's also very much an elite thing. We are, how many blocks are we from U Street here? It's about 8 blocks. You know, think tank row is, so we're talking about half a mile maybe. I mean, it's give or take. I mean, I can do it in the chair and try this 5 miles an hour. It's about 10 minutes. No one from north of U Street, you know, comes into the think tank community. That's even more egregiously true in London. One of the things I've discovered with PS21 is it's been much easier to get good, say, African Americans in New York, because African American policymakers like living in New York, actually don't like living in DC. You know, and therefore they don't. It becomes sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think I take your point on it being broader, but it's a really bizarre and interesting and very seductive world, which I really enjoy being, and I stay about 6 months here and I have to go home because I get over it.
Well, we're going to break down a lot of those issues that you're bringing up. So Maria, as the former government official who has that title now, you can be a good former government official. You saw what think tanks can do from the inside. Can you talk about when they are being most effective? When are they useful for you? You know, you're sitting in Turkey, working with groups. What is helpful for you coming from a group of people who, quote unquote, might be elitist and out of touch, but what do they provide you on the inside?
Yeah. So
when are they most effective?
I mean, generally on the inside, you're very focused on your particular issues and you're very deep in those issues. You can be quite myopic on those issues. So if you're the Syria desk officer, you are deep in Syria and you know everything that's going on the ground, you're talking to people, but you know, what good think tank research and convening can do is like get you to see the big picture and get you to see trends and get you to you know, think about, you know, okay, what can I learn from other case examples? So good research takes you out of your world for a little bit, the Syria world, and allows you to learn about civil war termination from 20 other countries and provides large end data that suggests, you know, what does the data suggest about effective ways to end civil wars? For example, that you wouldn't necessarily be thinking about when you're just 24/7 focused on your particular country or issue area. So big picture, trends, comparative analyses, and most importantly, what think tanks should provide, and they don't always, as I hear your point, is contrarian views. So DC is a bubble for the most part. I mean, it's the Beltway think. There is a lot of group mentality here and groupthink. You know, think tanks should challenge these kind of things. And this is one area where sometimes academic institutions are superior. They're not in DC. So I think about my colleagues in Denver at the Corbell Institute. They're not in DC. They do awesome quantitative studies on policy relevant topics relating to war and peace, and there's absolutely no pressure on them to conform to our frames, to conform to, you know, the DC speak, and they can sometimes challenge very basic things that we accept as givens. So, you know, I think that's a very important role. But I think the comparative analysis also is just very, very critical because people also, if you want to be effective in the field and propose, you know, solutions, you sometimes just need to hear examples from other places, other conflicts, other types of interventions that have worked or have failed abysmally in other places, just to jig your thinking. So in my view, that tended to be the most important role that academics and think tanks played when I was in government.
So Peter, going to you as a journalist, oftentimes the influence of think tanks is correlated with their visibility and how often they're played in the media. And as Andrew can probably talk about later, impact is sometimes measured in how many op-eds have you gotten out there, how many interviews have you had. As a journalist, how useful are think tank experts on the one hand, and also how do you see your work as intersecting or being symbiotic?
No, but I'm actually saying I'm now global affairs columnist at Reuters, which means that it's now all about what I think. Up until last year, I was a correspondent, which meant that it was about finding out stuff. So much more about what other people think. So for that, think tanks in DC were really, really useful, much more so than think tanks in London. Because if I phoned up a think tank guy in London, it's no different from someone at the university. So they may or may not know about what they know, but certainly someone like London, which is a really kind of Mandarin class city, that's not terribly useful for what I want to know, which is, I'm not going to get the Syria desk officer for two reasons. Firstly, Syria's a disaster, so they're not going to want to talk to me, and secondly, they're really busy. So what I want is someone who can tell me roughly the same thing as that person, who possibly used to have access, certainly in the security field, to high-end national security stuff, and will tell me probably, if I buy them a coffee, the same thing as their opposite number is going to tell the President of the United States. So that's really what I found think tanks really, really useful for. And DC is great because you can dig into that and you can find the former undersecretary for whatever and phone them up and say, right, okay, what do you think about this? And you know that you are getting a pretty close approximation to what someone in the Oval Office or Downing Street is getting. So that's incredibly useful. The second thing is indeed proper research. And there I don't draw a distinction between academic institutions and think tanks. If somebody has some bit of data that they've crunched that's really, really good, that tells me either what's going on or what people think. I mean, Pietron did 2 bits of research last year, one of which was counting up death tolls in wars, very similar to the work done by the Institute for Economics and Peace, and the other was just to poll national security experts on the likelihood of a bunch of conflicts. So that, I think, is where, I, as a journalist, I can say lots of people think that the risk of great power conflict is rising. That's probably true. I talk to all these people, but if I can actually say that the numbers have moved, that's really useful. That's incredibly useful for the think tank. Where they become less useful, where I use them much less, is saying what's going on the ground. So, that's where, one of the reasons when I started PS21, I took a different model was firstly we had no money, and secondly, I wanted to be able to reach into people who did stuff and get them into a sort of think tank like discussing about it. So if I want to know what's going on in Syria, I probably do not go to the Syria program in DC think tank. If I want to know what the Syria policy team are saying, I go there. If I want to know what's going on the ground, then that's where you use your other reporting skills. That's where you start sort of trying. We have a bureau in Beirut who are talking to people on the ground. That's where I try and find maybe journalists who come back from somewhere, people who really, really get that. I think DC, a lot of the world is about arbitrage, right? The difference between what things cost and valued in different places. DC think tanks are fantastic for finding out what DC thinks, and often almost useless for finding out what's actually going on. So take the recent Baltic States. If I talk to people in think tanks, like the Atlantic Council about the Baltic States, I will find out what America thinks is going on in the Baltic States, which is incredibly useful. If I actually want to find out what's actually going on in the Baltic States, then I want to reach out to a journalist. I might reach out to a think tank in Tallinn, although that will only really tell me what the policy in Tallinn think is going on in the Eastern Baltic States. If I want to know what's going on in Narva, which is where World War III might break out, it's actually on the front line between Russia and it's a town with 70-80% Russian-speaking population, then I'm just going to have then I call on the newspaper editor in Narva. That's so think tanks are good at what they're good at. But if I want to crack what's going on in the NSC, then I find out the last NSC or the next NSC. Point about it being elite. If I want to find out what's going on in Trump's NSC, no one I can call because I don't know who's going to be in it. He's got a choice. It's going to be an interesting choice if he wins. I don't assume he will, which is that he either goes with his gut and ignores his NSC, so it doesn't matter, which I think is probably what he said. That he brings in the regular, usual suspects, or third, that he goes for a kind of, that he goes for a much wider selection. I'm not sure he's necessarily the kind of guy to look for that, but, where you get a bunch of different people. The new politicians who are rising, the Trumps, the Sanders, the whoever the hell comes after that, because I don't think either of them will make it, may well want to look beyond the existing kind of group. I don't really know how you do that. PS21 is one model for doing it. There are some other models that the various governments said, look, I think open government is probably an example of a slightly different model, where if you want to put together a Syria team who understands Syria, rather than which has to include your usual suspects, but it also needs other people, how you do that. I don't think the existing DC think tank system does that, but that's your kind of challenge.
Well, Andrew, you have the privilege or the difficulty of having to often measure influence, either to donors or to the government or to board members. Articulating what impact are we having on policy is an incredibly difficult thing to do. As I'm finding in my research, it's very hard to measure influence. So what are sort of the main measures you use to highlight influence, and how important is the research itself, which Peter and Maria have talked about, as it is to the relationships, as it is to institutional reputation or media visibility? How do these various factors help you define influence?
Sure. Let me start with something else, and then I'll take those in reverse order. Which I think traditionally, you're right, Peter, that think tanks tend to be self-referential and tied to the Washington policy community, but I think there is a different model also. Which is, one of the things that we've consciously tried to do at the Wilson Center, and I'm not sure we always do it well, but is to try and bring in voices from outside of Washington. And I think there is an opportunity to do that. And again, I think we do it better in some areas than we do in others. So I wouldn't say we sort of, I think USIP does a lot of that, actually. I wouldn't say we universally do it well. And sometimes the people that do that really well have the disadvantage that they don't know Washington as well. There's actually that tension between the people who are really good at knowing. We don't have a lot of former policymakers. We have a lot of academics and journalists, and a few NGO people. We have a few former policymakers, but they tend not to be the assistant secretary, undersecretary level, except for our CEOs.
Both you guys, both USIP and you guys, and maybe New America, have a lot of one-year fellowships, right? For outsiders.
We have a lot of one-year fellowships, and so we bring in a lot of people from outside the country consciously. We bring in a lot of speakers from outside the country. It's got its advantages and disadvantages. There's a disadvantage if you don't have the real policymakers in your organization. You don't necessarily have the same kind of relationships. You still have relationships. People still listen to you, and they will sometimes listen to you because you're saying something different, or you're bringing in someone who says something different. But you have less immediate access than someone who is the best friend and spends Christmas or Passover dinner with someone who is the current undersecretary, right? So that there's a trade-off in this, and there are a few people that do both very well, but there tends to be it's different models. Research, I think we all have different ideas of what research is at a think tank. At a university, you know what it is. Going to Maria's point, at a university, it's new knowledge, right? You're doing new knowledge on a topic that you think is interesting. In theory, you're opening up space, and that's what you get tenure for. And you get rewards in other ways for it. At a think tank, it's what can you do research on that has an impact? I think there's a range here also. There's some people who don't really do research, but they have knowledge. And so it's that knowledge base. They are the former undersecretary, or they're the great scholar on something, or they're a journalist that spent 20 years in the field. And so they're not necessarily doing research. They're writing, they're doing opinion articles, but they basically have a knowledge base and they're keeping up in the field, and that gives them some influence. On the other extreme, there are some people who do real original research. They're crunching numbers. They are, going to wherever it is that they need to go to do research. They're actually in the trenches doing serious research. And that's sort of the other extreme. You find those people in some think tanks. In between, and I would say this is a really large number, there are people who are sort of popularizers of research, right? Which is, and I think we do a lot of this, frankly, which is, we're connecting people who are doing real research, either in journalism or at universities, with the policy community. And sometimes we ourselves are a bridge there. I spend a lot of time, I've done real research. I've actually been on the other extreme at some point in my life, but I would say I do very little real research these days. I do a lot of interpreting, keeping in touch with people who are doing some of the deep research that will never be read in the policy community because it's too abstract, and it's published in journals that won't be read by people in DC. and trying to bring it into the public light. Write it in a way in an op-ed or in short form that is then useful for people that have to make decisions. And a lot of my colleagues do that as well. I have some colleagues who are incredibly good at doing original research, but a lot of people are really good at either finding people. We host a lot of 150 people a year who are doing their own research, or they're really popularizing research, right? They're trying to find things, if you want to know what's happening in Nigeria today. I have a colleague who I would say probably doesn't have time to do a lot of research on Nigeria, but she keeps in touch with the people that are doing research on Nigeria. So she's really good at sort of, being able to channel what's going on and what's being said about corruption, what's being said about governance issues, what's being said about security apparatus in Nigeria, and so on and so forth. So I think I think there's a range of what happens there. And finally, I think think tanks vary, and then individuals within think tanks vary, right? And programs within think tanks vary on whether they really are doing, the emphasis is on sort of research and sort of new ideas and pushing an agenda forward, or they're more on the relationships. Like, I know something already and I'm going to work the relationships. And ideally you have both, right? And which comes ultimately to impact, which is you need both of these to have an impact, right? You need both to have something new and interesting and different to say, but you also need to know how to get to the people that make decisions or that write about this or have opinions. Now, in the past, if you go back 30 or 40 years, this was primarily a small group of people in policy who had policy influence. Today, frankly, and I don't think because think tanks have become less elitist, I think the country has become less elitist, which is actually a different question. Think tanks may be as elitist as they ever were, but the country actually changed significantly, right? So the policy discussion about Mexico, take a subject that I know something about, U.S.-Mexico relations, or better or worse, and sometimes, by the way, I think it's worse, but in the large scheme of things, it's probably much better, is no longer a conversation among 5 people at the State Department, 2 at the Defense Department, 1,600 at Homeland Security.
And none of them are Mexican.
None of them are Mexican, exactly, right? And then also their counterparts, which are the same number in Mexico, right? And this is actually a conversation, when I was working on U.S.-Mexico relations, the extent that I still do, I spent a lot of time with people in local governments. Spent a lot of time with people, on mayor's staff and state governments. Honestly, with migrant-led organizations. Spend a lot of time with, people in state governments in Mexico, people in NGOs in Mexico working on issues. This is a much larger conversation that goes on among a lot of people. And so those how you have impact is much less today about changing policy, though that is, the holy grail for all of us, right, is you write that memo that ends up in the Oval Office on the president's desk and suddenly changes policy, right? And I've seen it happen, by the way. I mean, it does actually happen once in a while, just sort of by chance. But generally speaking, what your real influence is not that, and it's not the number of op-eds and sometimes you testify in Congress. It's not the number of books you've done. It is, are you able in some way to shape the conversation about the issue you care about, and or come up with an idea that actually moves the conversation down the road in a way that you believe is useful. That's incredibly hard to measure. If you want, we can talk about that, questions and answers. I haven't found a way to measure that. But that is ultimately, I think, the measure is, can you either see footprints of what you have been talking about in decisions that are made, or can you see footprints of what you're talking about in the way the conversation shifted over time? And sometimes that's just as powerful. You're not changing necessarily the decision that's made, but you're changing the terrain on which that decision will be made over time.
Great. I'm going to do 2 more topics, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from all of you. I have a lot of questions, so I could keep going, but obviously I've sort of dedicated a lot of my time to this issue. And this is open to any of you, this question. This issue of accountability and credibility is something I have struggled with a lot in my research. In academia, there's certain mechanisms that allow for accountability in terms of you have to always publish what your funding sources are when you're publishing research. There are professional organizations. There's the American Anthropological Association. There's the American Political Sciences Association. There are certain standards of ethics of research. Such thing does not exist in the think tank world. How do you, each of you or whoever wants to answer, how do you feel about what are the mechanisms for accountability, and what does accountability mean in a context where you're trying to influence policy?
I mean, accountability in the U.S. Institute of Peace sense is perhaps different compared to other think tanks because, you know, our funding, our base funding is coming from Congress. So we're a quasi-federal institution, and so we're accountable to the American people. Theoretically, we have to defend our budget. We have to explain where we've had impact to be able to justify continued funding. So we don't, you know, the U.S. Institute of Peace does not accept private funds from either other governments, obviously, or foundations, except in a very limited sense as part of our academy work. So sometimes we can accept private funds to support scholarships for people who are taking our trainings or courses online or out in the field. But so it's a different sort of, you know, mechanism, I think. But basically, we do have to justify what we're doing to defend, you know, our use of taxpayer funding. Whereas the Atlantic Council, yeah, there are often controversies about which governments are you accepting funding for, you know, the amount, is it inhibiting freedom and independence in writing? So this is often a tension. I mean, think tanks like to pride themselves that, yes, we're getting funding from X, Y, or Z, either Gulf country or whatever, Norway, but there are no strings. I'm sure they have some imperial past.
Arctic takeover.
You want to talk about imperialism?
I think it's an important point because I think, you know, I mean, firstly, I would start. I mean, whenever I'm talking like I would deconstruct it more, it's really about the individuals. So the question is who owns you and why, and I think it's quite hard and probably would require someone who was psychotic or otherwise strange to get to your mid-30s by not being owned by a bunch of things, dictated by your background and what you want to do. You know, I am British. The British taxpayer paid for me not to stay in a nursing home for the rest of my life. You know, big deal, and that experience shapes me. You know, my family are in the UK. There are no great threats to the UK, but if you're Israeli, that changes it. Israel, I think, is an interesting country because it doesn't have a moral foreign policy. It has a we're not going to be wiped out foreign policy, and we're not going to apologize for that because someone nearly did. You know, so that you know, it's you know, you know, and that you know, people are shaped that if you have kids, that shapes you know, it shapes you. So you know, track back from that. So that shapes a lot of institutions. In PS21, I mean, some of you guys, I don't give you a bit of background because I think it's illustrative. So I'm obviously pretty disabled. I broke my neck covering the Civil War in Sri Lanka. I'm largely paralyzed and sort of down. I am very dependent on care. What does that mean? That means that nobody's offered me a job since I broke my neck 10 years ago. Nor, I suspect, was anybody going to. My employer could not fire me, and therefore I've had a career within that. So, you know, let's go back to 2014. What happens? I get stuck in bed with a pressure sore, so I'm getting up maybe a couple of hours, maybe 1 or 2 days a week. So now people are even less likely to hire me. And it turns out I can do my job by phone, which is really boring because it means I don't meet people. So, okay, so so what do? I look at things. I had the idea for PS21 a while back, and I thought, you know, there is a place for a non-ideological, non-national think tank, and yada yada. But actually, you know, you then change your. But then I thought, I was stuck in bed, so I can't do it. And after about another 6 months, I thought, I can't do anything else. Maybe I should revisit this idea. And actually, it's kind of, I can make this work because then I can build an organization that is, to an extent, built around A, what I can afford, which is nothing. Well, actually, not nothing, but you know, some venues, alcohol, and maybe some chairs. You know, B, I have enough. What I have is enough social capital with a bunch of people that I can reach out to my contacts list like a supplement to a group. If I do that, I get a whole bunch of events because people will come to you. Thank you very much. And also, I'm hacking the system, so I'm not the fact that. I mean, you know, I don't play this, but someone like yourselves might have thought we won't give Pete Apps a fellowship, one fellowship for journalists. I'm pretty sure made this decision because we're a bit worried that A, he'll be really expensive, B, he won't turn up, and C, someone will complain and I might lose my job. Well, PS1 short-circuited that because suddenly it's cheap. So, you know, I got a financial settlement for Reuters, so that gave me enough money to put into PS21. PS1 cost last year about 3,000 quid, 2,000 of which were on insurance, and the rest of which were on alcohol. You know, we had had some very good volunteers. Carrie Kuno, who some of you know, is one of our editors, who, for largely selfish reasons, decided that giving it a chunk of their time was worth it. And it's generally worked out for all my volunteers. They got good jobs afterwards. I think, I don't feel bad about not paying my volunteers, none of whom were full-time, because I think they've all got a lot out of it. So, that built me a model. Now, I might go on and do other things after that. I think that the PSR model we've used is useful, and therefore, even if I decided to say, for example, go into politics, I would try and put some safeguards in to make sure that PSR1 doesn't get dragged to one side. So if it's like, if I'm holding an event on the future of the British left, that's probably not a PS21 event. And I have a board. There are a bunch of ways in which think tanks and charities in the UK are supposed to be independent. They do not work, let's be honest, because in theory, if you're a charity, we're very unusual. We're a charity in the UK, so we were cleared by the UK Charity Commission. To do that, we had to prove we were non-ideological. We actually genuinely are, so we were able to prove that. Everyone else, they just kind of hope that they don't notice they're not. I don't know enough about the
In the
non-profit
US,
thing.
most think things are 501c3s.
What does that require? Does anyone need it?
I mean, you just basically can't be a lobbyist.
Yeah.
And use it
Almost
for
all think tanks exist almost entirely to lobby on behalf of the people that fund them. So yes, we're unusual. We actually genuinely meet those requirements, and actually, largely as an intellectual exercise, I'm quite actually we say that way. In reality, of course, once we're there, I could turn it into a future of the British left think tank. Very unlikely anyone would complain about it, and I just feel slightly bad about it. So there's an interesting. I just want to throw it back to Negar, because you're an anthropologist who studies think tanks, therefore your thoughts about this are probably more interesting than the rest of the panel. So you've looked at where you're rats in a cage. You've looked at this for a couple of years. What strikes you most about this about the way think tanks work?
I mean, this question of accountability, to bring it back, I think is a complicated one. And what I was pleasantly surprised to hear that this is a conversation that's going on within the community itself. I think there's been a few high-profile New York Times pieces, et cetera, bringing up this issue of funding and whether this is intellectual lobbying. But what I have found is that a lot of people are taking that very seriously inside, and they're actually having this conversation. And what comes out of that, I think, will be important in terms of, are we going to create some type of ethical boundaries? Are we going to have sort of professional rules of the game? And one of the things that I'd be interested in, if Andrew could maybe speak to, is one of the things you find when you come here is there's very little naming and shaming, but you can tell when people have sort of crossed the line. Can you talk about how these internal mechanisms work and how there's maybe perhaps quieter ways that the community is responding to this?
Well, I think the answer is, and it's an imperfect accountability, right? But by the way, this is a subject for nonprofits in general, by the way. Accountability of nonprofits is a big topic of which think tanks are a piece. But the thing that I think has been a somewhat controlling, but an imperfect mechanism, is that think tanks rely on their reputation, right? I mean, you're taken seriously to the extent that people either think that you represent a really well-researched, grounded opinion, or you represent an opinion in line with whatever particular constituency that you say you belong to, right? So I mean, one or the other. Those are not always, and sometimes both of those. But if you belong to the majority of think tanks that are not, partisan, specifically partisan, your reputation really is your basis. So to the extent that think tanks get criticized for not being reputable, or get questioned for perhaps towing the line for a particular funder or a particular point of view, then they tend to self-correct often. Not always, but I think that's been the mechanism of correction. Because ultimately all you got is your reputation if you want to be believed, if you want to be taken seriously out there. It is a hugely active conversation among think tanks right now. I would say, having run a program and overseeing day-to-day operations of an organization, I mean, one of the things that we try to do is diversify funding, because there's no way, I mean, as much as anyone will tell you, we get funding from X, but they don't exert control. I mean, that's probably true on research. I mean, I feel fairly comfortable in saying that no funder can control the outcome of any specific piece of research. But do they get access? And this is true whether it's a foundation, by the way, or an individual, or a government, or a business. Do they get some sort of access? Do they determine what you can do? Because, by the way, much of the control, I mean, the biggest control from funders is not them trying to control your output, which they usually know they can't do. It is, you have 5 projects that you think are incredibly important, and you only get 2 of those funded. And they are funded because either the foundations or the corporations or the individuals you know, have decided that those are things that they care about, right? So the biggest control is not actually on the back end of things. Now we have, X corporation in the door or the Ford Foundation in the door, they're gonna control us. They usually know they can't do that. It is, wow, the 5 things we wanna do, it's more likely we'll do energy because, the energy cut of this because there's more funding in that lane, or it's more likely that we'll do this angle that has to do with migration rather than rule of law because we know that the foundation, is interested in migration rather than the rule of law side. And so those controls are much more upfront actually, and those do matter. And the only way you get around things like that is you diversify, right? And that itself is imperfect as well, because what that means is you're essentially, you have sort of, and you diversify within each pool. So you diversify within foundations, you diversify within corporations, diversify with individuals, you question how much you get from governments, and then you diversify among those pools as well. So.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask Maria a very specific question about this because she's someone who's bringing really interesting ideas into the think tank world that is not the mainstream of security. But in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of put that out as a teaser. So if you guys are interested, please ask her about how she's injecting pretty non-mainstream ideas into the security debate.
I'm going to say one very quick observation.
Yes.
You know how I can tell that from here?
How?
Because she's dressed more interestingly than most people. And I think it comes back to diversity. But there's a thing with disability lobby in the UK. I'm not sure whether it's more widespread, but I think it's very powerful, which is nothing about us without us. When we try and do something at PS21, if you're talking about Eastern Europe, if you want to go into Eastern Europe and the Baltics, you want to have a program in Russian. That is, you want to, most think tanks here are actually pretty open about what they want. The USIP, it's a US government funded think tank. That's pretty obvious. That tells you a bunch of things that it isn't, a bunch of things it is. Most of them are semi-military industrial complex. They want to keep America strong, which would explain why they're funded by Northrop Grumman. But if you want, the trick is, particularly if you're discussing something that's really messy. If you're discussing inner cities, does anyone live in an inner city? You will raise the game of a discussion by having a 19-year-old from Northwest Washington, D.C. on a panel on inner cities compared to having a bunch of white guys. Just thinking, this is a panel on think tanks which contains one able-bodied white guy. That is incredibly rare. I am invited to all male white panels, as a journalist, every day of a solid week. There's a really good one at NYU. It's Ian Bremmer and like 3 other white men discussing the role of America. It would be a better discussion if it had anyone on that panel who wasn't that foreign, disabled, it doesn't even matter which diversity they went for, it would be a better discussion.
He keeps anticipating my question. Well, my last question were gonna be about diversity. So there's a male-female diversity question, there's race diversity, there's sexual orientation, there's able-bodied, disabled, there's also very extremes in the political spectrum, diversity issues. Very rarely in, especially the foreign policy world, are you going to see people who are fully anti, U.S. having a role in the world. You're going to, as much as Brookings will say it's not ideological, they're not going to invite people who don't want the U.S. to have an active role in the world. That is part of their mission. So I'm just going to very briefly, if you'll allow me, share some results from my own research. So I study Middle East policy experts. So of my own sample of 150, there are only 43 who are women, of the top Middle East experts in Washington. There are only 15 women of color, 33 men of color. Not a single one of these experts is African American. Only 2 are Hispanic American. They both happen to be Cuban American, which is interesting. The rest are Arab, Turkish, Iranian, Pakistani, Indian, or Filipino origin. And only 1 woman reported to me having a disability. So you can probably do this across any issue. The numbers are pretty bad. And if we go to the women, I'm sorry to tokenize you, Maria, but why do you think so few women are rising to the top? Especially when you go into a think tank, most of the first round of people you interact with are women. The research assistants are women, Interns are primarily women. Why are they not making their way up higher in these organizations? As a young woman who has had to go through these.
Okay. Also because the token woman. All the essentialized. The rest of the discussion.
We do have a token able-bodied white person.
And I guess I'm the person of color too.
You're very no, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think, in general, the international relations, international security field has been dominated by males for a long time. I mean, so, increasingly though, I would say, and, one thing I'm proud of my alma mater, the Fletcher School, about is that, I think now the majority, if not more, higher percentage of PhD graduates in international security are women. But I think like Fletcher's maybe in the minority in this case. So, it's been a bastion for a while, and sort of change takes time. I think, mentorship and sort of professional development is not necessarily institutionalized in think tanks. This is not a proactive part of what they do. Women, especially women who are mothers, may have a difficult time, with work schedules, with flexible mechanisms that allows them to contribute while being mothers, especially if they just had a child. So, I mean, there are a lot of obstacles in the way of women quickly rising through the ranks in a linear way that men often have. Women's routes are often nonlinear, and there has to be an openness, a flexibility, and a willingness to invite them to have more sort of flexible schedules. I think in general, and sort of pointing the finger back at my gender, if I'm able to do that, as long as I'm representing all women, is that, I mean, I think when it comes to publishing and publications, women tend to be more cautious in general, so we're not going to just put stuff out just to beat the others to the punch. And that doesn't mean our research is always better or more sophisticated, but there's a little, just a little bit more caution involved, I think, at least what I've observed with my women colleagues, that may sort of at least sort of slow things down. But I think, in terms of ways around this, having role models in think tanks, it's a chicken or the egg thing. You need women in leadership positions to encourage other women to participate and to, to give them mentorship to rise through the ranks. So you actually need, like, think tanks need diversity policies, right? Like, it needs to be institutionalized, that this is important for the effectiveness of our think tank and for, the impact that our research is going to have. The diversity and effectiveness tend to go together. And so I think diversity policies can matter for think tanks. And then if you really want to change things, get your board involved. So the board should be involved in discussion about performance metrics. Like, how are we doing on gender diversity? How are we measuring impact? How many senior analysts who are getting paid are women at our think tank? Is that changing over time? How many are directors? How many are in leadership positions? What is the media tracking of women? Just to like keep this visible. So I think these are a couple of ways think tanks could just, invite more women and help them rise through the ranks. But it's going to take time. It's going to take more visible women in the media who are like on CNN and BBC, whatever. So then it's like, of course, women should be doing this.
I think board membership is important. Actually, we've got a 50% female board at PSR, and we did that by becoming quite a young board. There is another institution where that I am involved with, which is called PARC, which is a government, UK government based think tank. Its board is very, very predominantly male. I think if you haven't, there's a reason for that. It's very actually hard to find good older female board members, and those who are very heavily committed. So it was easy. Of my good top flight Rolodex, people in their say 60s is majority male. And most strikingly, I find it much harder to get FaceTime with the 10 to 20% who are women. And virtually none of them would have had time to be on my board. It's much easier if you reach out. I mean, the two of our female board members who are American are Sydney Olnick, former chief of staff for Middle East policy for DoD, and Catherine Mayer, who's now executive director of Wikipedia. She's 34, I think. So they're very, very top-end people. And I was able to, and I exerted a load of my social and persuasive capital to get them in, because they are really in demand. and you know, and I don't know how long I'll keep Catherine. I don't know because now she runs Wikipedia. You know, so it's difficult. If you don't have a balanced board, you end up with a board that doesn't care about metrics. You end up with people not caring about how many panelists and participants would. And there's also a problem. I mean, I'm going to have to call up one of my volunteers to say, like, this is the third all-male panel you've given me. And you know what? The people who book those all-male panels are almost always women. And I don't really know what you do about that. But you know, but I think the simple thing you have metrics. You just say you know, I'm not about tokenism. I know there's a problem with doing all-male panels. Sometimes that works. They're never as good as the mixed. But you've got to say, right, okay, we've done 2. This is it. You know, no further. You know, we are going to have a mixed panel. Do we have an all-white panel, which is kind of a solid kind? You know, I mean, yes, we can take a certain number, but if you've got an all-white panel discussing Southeast Asia, which I had one of, I feel bad about it. I don't think that happens that often in this town.
Andrew, you've actually worked on this, and you've attended conferences that have been about ethnic and racial diversity also. If you can maybe talk about what you've observed.
No, this is an issue I spend a lot of time on, and some of my colleagues do as well, with some success and some failures actually along the way. And you know, as the one representative of able white males here, say everything's fine. No, this is I come from a fairly diverse family. More than you can tell from looking at me. So this is an issue that's, and I like to be in the company of people at least as diverse as my own family. So, which is not necessarily true in the think tank community. So this has been a big issue. And one of the things we found, I mean, we think of diversity in 3 terms, and then we think of sort of 3 sites to look at this. One is in diversity in ethnic and racial terms, one in terms of gender, and one in terms of ideas, which matters to us is trying to be nonpartisan. By the way, we fail on that one sometimes too. I mean, that's actually, you know, we have various, you know, when we make progress on one of the ones, we're not doing so well on the others here. And then we think about it in 3 sites, and those sites are human capital, which is, you know, staff, interns, and fellows. We think about it in terms of audiences. Who are our audience? Are we talking to the same audiences out there? And then programming, which should be driven by audiences, right?
So you just give me those 3 categories again. It's
ideas, ethnicity/race, and gender, right? And then the sites are human capital, who you have in the building.
Does somebody get what you have to say? Carry on.
What?
You know, carry on.
Oh, okay. You know, so we've had some successes on the leadership side, is actually looking for more diverse leadership. Although I would say, you know, we have a really diverse in black-white terms, very diverse leadership compared to where we were, not perfect, but compared to where we were 5 years ago, you know, but my wife is Latina, so, and we have not done very well there. So she reminds me occasionally when I, you know, sort of point out that, you know, we're suddenly a much more diverse leadership that, you know, yeah, it sort of depends. And I sat down with a couple of colleagues to talk about what to do Hispanic Heritage Month earlier this week and end of last week. And it was interesting because one thing, you know, we started going, okay, who should be on the committee? They were interested in this to the mid-career Latina women, and who should be on this? And we realized, in fact, how few people we actually have. So, you know, and I live in a world that speaks Spanish at home. So, you know, I mean, for me, that was kind of I knew it, but it was kind of a kind of in-your-face moment. We've had much more trouble with fellows, actually. We have 2 categories of fellows. Our academic fellows, mostly academic, are shockingly white still, less male, actually much more even on gender, not so even ideologically, and not so even on ethnicity. The people we bring in, and here's an important learning for us, and I think it's true of a lot of this, is also the people we bring in as short-term public policy fellows are much more diverse because they come from diverse backgrounds. They're journalists, they're NGO people, they're former policymakers. They're coming from areas where diversity is proceeded a lot faster than perhaps in academia. And one of the things, I guess, on all of this that we've learned along the way is that the more you have diverse pools up front, the more likely you are to have diversity inside the building when you're looking at human capital side. Program and audiences is a conversation we've just started, and I can't say we've done anything with it other than have conversations, but part of the reality is that this goes back to a point Peter made earlier, is I think they tend to speak to the same audiences. I mean, some of us may try and be more broad, some of us more narrow, but to some extent we kind of are looking at people who are sort of actively engaged in whatever we define as our issue area. You know, we're doing global policy, so it's kind of who does global policy? Well, it's kind of a defined set of groups around the country, defined set of groups of people here, defined set of people in government. If you start to think, and I can only say we've had this, started to have the conversation, we haven't actually done anything that would be new and exciting on this, but if you begin to think that in fact America is changing demographically very quickly, if you begin to think that your audience may not be the same people you've always talked to, that in fact there may be other audiences out there that are engaged in different ways, that begins to change who you think of as your audience, but it also begins to change a little bit how you define the issues you work on. So
I think that's
again, not a satisfying solution,
No.
but you know.
well, we can
use the
continue this conversation, so it's not be elitists, think tankers. Why don't we open it up to questions? And if you could just identify yourself when you are asking a question. So I saw the gentleman all the way in the back. Yes. You say your name, please.
Yes, my name is Sabi Hamid. I'm the Center for Egyptian American Relations, and this question can be to anyone in the panel. I always like to make some analytical thinking with academia. In academia, of course, there is how do you get the feedback? We can always use the most ultimate system, which is accreditation, and of course, you know, things like how big is the endowment and so on. Do you think this will bring anything to the world of think tanks, since it is still developing and it's a new phenomenon?
Accreditation.
It's hard to figure out who would accredit think tanks. I mean, it's kind of one of those niches where it has not, it's small enough, it's enough of a niche that no one has done it in the way they have with universities. There is one attempt to do this from the University of Pennsylvania, which is sort of a reputational index. Some people like it, some people don't. We all use it, obviously, because it's the only thing out there, but it's not, you know, I think some people would say it's certainly not an accreditation in any way. I mean, it's a very subjective index. It's a great idea. Some people have tried to build.
No, it's not a great idea. No, it's not a great idea.
Accreditation is probably the wrong term, but I think the idea of beginning to look at least at what are objective measures of what people do is interesting. But again, that's not going to be a measurement of, it's a measurement of outputs rather than outcomes, right? So you can get a rough measurement if you want of, for example, you know, web page traffic or, you know, publications in different fields, which is probably useful to have. It's probably more than we have now. We would take some money to do this. It would actually be useful. But then, of course, what it would do is make us all gravitate to particular outputs rather than the outcomes. So, you know, useful, but probably not the end product.
Well, I would say we accredit things because it's dangerous and we don't. So we accredit drivers because people can't, if people actually genuinely can't drive, they shouldn't drive. The problem with accreditation in something like think tanks is it becomes inherently exclusive. And I think that if there are ways of, if you don't have your accreditation, then you're not a real thing. And I think in that space, it's got dangers as well.
And actually, I mean, just to add to that, I think one of the things interesting about think tanks is, though large think tanks have a benefit of scale, one of the things that's happened with the democratization of communications, you can actually be a very small organization, you can have no building, and you can have a huge impact on a particular area. You know, maybe you can't have a huge impact on 16 areas, but you could choose one or two things and drive the conversation even more effectively.
Michael Lee, I'm formerly a EU official and worked with think tanks in Washington, Brussels, and other places. I would like to question the assumption or the claim that the main purpose of think tanks is to influence policy. From what I've observed, and speaking mainly about broad spectrum think tanks interested in foreign policy, security, and so on, it seems to me that this is a kind of spin-off or serendipity, but not really the main thing that drives them. I mean, they are very broad, very diffuse. They share a broad agenda. If you look at all the main foreign policy think tanks, they don't diverge very much in their broad interests. I mean, if your concern is peace, if your concern is promoting transatlantic relations, if your concern is preserving the liberal international order, it's so broad that the idea that, you know, what drives them is the desire to influence policy. This seems to me to be occasionally the case. I mean, from an anthropological or from an economic or social point of view, they're not-for-profit businesses, and they're competing, and they have in a marketplace. tanks. And there are fewer issues than there are think tanks, so they're scrambling. Everybody has to have a seminar on whatever the issue is of the week. And they do exercise influence, I would say, more through people than through reports or analyses or policy recommendations. People who spend time in think tanks, then go back into government, they can hit the road, running immediately because they're kept up to speed in think tanks. I think that's useful. But I don't think that, and then on the other side, the receptivity of policymakers to recommendations or orientations or such, very low. I mean, in the UK, I've spoken to advisors, to the Prime Minister, ask them, have they seen this or that report? They look at me almost pityingly, as if, do you really think we would have the time? Of course, they think,
But I would say one thing that amazed me, we started doing events for Guest Room 1 in my admittedly very nice flat in London in January. Around April, a bloke turned up from the Cabinet Office. And since July, we've been running stuff in various Whitehall buildings, about 6 p.m. in the evening, hour and a half long discussion, then go to the pub. And what they wanted, and it was an incredibly real want, was to get outside views, interesting discussions that could fit just on the limit of their working day, that would give them new ideas. So when these are very busy people, I agree, you've done this for a living, you basically want, if you're a policy, not policy maker, but in that circle, your 10 minutes of the day that count when you sit with your principal and you have your view on the thing. If you can say, I met a Syrian or a Syrian last night or someone who lives in Syria and they said this and therefore I think that, your time is probably 2/3 up. That you can deliver, and there is a hunger for that. If you said, here's my book, unless it's a novel, they're going to read it. If it's, Maria, this is really your game.
No, but I see a lot of counterexamples. I agree. There are going to be other incentives for think tanks, but speaking from a USIP perspective, I see every day, the different teams at the Institute trying to reframe major issues involving national security. So applying a peace-building lens to this whole obsession in this town with countering violent extremism. So what does a peace-building lens? It matters in terms of what you focus on, the key actors the tools that you're applying. So I see this in practice at the Institute. My research is focused on nonviolent movements and why they're critical development actors and why they're more effective than violent insurgencies. So when I can go into policy meetings at the White House, at aid, at state, World Bank, wherever, and present data that suggests that nonviolent movements, oh, by the way, historically are twice as effective as armed insurgencies. They tend to contribute to democratization and they tend to contribute to civil peace. That's like a compelling reframe that just gets new conversation started and presents options other than military force for things that we always think need military force and military interventions. So, I've seen this work well in certain places. I do think sometimes it's very helpful to have been in government. I think you can speak a language in a way and you can build on things that they're talking about, initiatives that they're working on. So you're not coming in as a good idea fairy who, I may have 100 ideas for how to improve world peace, but it's not going to relate to anything they're working on, to the types of discourse that they're having. So, I think certain things can be helpful, but individuals matter too. Individuals within think tanks can make a difference and can, build relationships and impact policy discourse.
Just for the one hand there, we'll go you. Sorry for the pointing.
In terms of promoting diversity within think tanks, how do you feel about considering hair color as
I should look at them in my data set. Or whether they have hair or not.
within the think tank community? It seems like there are the mega actors, U.S. Institute for Peace, Atlantic Council in terms of Atlantic relations. How do smaller, maybe more dissenting think tanks gain a larger voice when maybe they're not backed by the same people who maybe own media outlets, and they can only be found on smaller websites like Truth Out or Jacobin, something like that?
I've got some thoughts on that because it's what I did last year. I mean, look, it's about getting noticed, right? So first question, I think what the point that I didn't make, I want to let you finish. You talk about ethnicity, I would talk about experience. Because it factors in I remember after I broke my neck, not long after, I mean like 4 or 5 weeks. Because as a white guy, you're kind of aware actually that you're often crowded off panels because they want people who aren't you. And that's particularly true of being a young white person trying to break in anyway, because you're aware of this, and the simple truth is that if you are an Ivy League educated Arab American, there's a bunch of you probably will find it easier to get through some narrow doors that are harder at that level. The white person. I'm thinking I'm a diversity tick box now. Things will be easier.
The numbers go
But
against
they
what
are not. I mean, it's I mean, yes, all women, but it's also yes, all people who are even remotely different. And the takeaway of saying to Negar Razavi, if you look at I finally get privilege. Privilege is when it's more stuff you have it if you don't have it in an area. The most obvious answer to it is every other spare bit of privilege you've got. So, step forward 3 really obvious examples, myself, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton. They are people who have one obvious lack of privilege, and the way they've got what they are is being A, really quite good, and B, having a shed load of other bits of privilege. Education, connections, you name it. That's how you get to be me. Yes, being good works up to a point. But if I show me a successful African American woman, and I will often show you a successful Ivy League educated African American woman. That's the way the system works. You understand that if you have one of those tick box, when you fall into one of those gaps. It's why all women get it. It's why all disabled people get it. It's why everyone else kind of gets it. It's why I think there's always something different about everybody, and you realize it. I am not willing. I realize for the discussion to talk about the disadvantages I have as a disabled person, because I'm still trying to squeeze through some doors, and I am too scared to talk about it. But I think the other thing about relevance. I mean, I did this because I wanted interesting conversations. People are motivated by incredibly basic desires, primarily for relevance. And that means different things for different people. What people want not to be is locked up in a room for the rest of their life. This is not true of everybody, but it's true of 95% of people. People want to feel they're important. That means different things for everybody. Particular think tanks are no different. Sometimes they have narrow expectations. Sometimes they have, sometimes they want to be Maria. I mean, some people might want to be you. Some people might want to be Negar. Some people want to be something else. That is kind of what drives people. I mean, and it means different things. But it really comes down to that.
And also, I mean, you look at dissent. So maybe I'm just in a different category because I study dissent, and so civil disobedience is sort of my cup of tea. So I would probably be more apt than others to seek out things that smaller blogs. Like I love meeting with the Heinrich Bold people in town and hearing what they have to say and what they're writing about. I love hearing from non-Americans in town, frankly. So I think, being creating your own events, like on policy relevant topics that the rest of the town is talking about, but you have a particular lens or a frame, you being a convener, just with the reframe would be refreshing, I think, for a lot of people. And obviously getting the social media and showing up at the other events and just injecting those key dissenting points and questions, I think is a way you can have, amplify your voice.
And to both of those, and I actually am less cynical on think tanks being businesses. Most of the people I know, and maybe this is just the universe I'm in, got involved in what they're doing because they were incredibly passionate about something. For me, it was having lived in Mexico 4 or 5 years on the U.S.-Mexico border and thinking, I came back and realized Americans don't understand Mexico. They have no idea how important the neighbors are for our daily life in the United States. And I want to do something to change the conversation. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I actually remember, I was a 29-year-old, starting grad student, and I was like, I grew up in D.C. I'm going to come back to D.C. I'm going to change the way people in this country think about crazy idea. Not sure it worked, but I think quite often the people that you get in think tanks. Sometimes you get people who are really in holding tanks, that they're sort of waiting to get back into government or waiting to get the next job, or they're waiting the time out from leaving government till they can get a private sector job and make money. But you also get a lot of really passionate people who are trying to figure out how to change a conversation the way Maria is about something that they care passionately about. And I think that goes to the small think tank question as well, which is if you care deeply and passionately about something, you have a compelling case to make, and you can articulate it in a way that that can convince other people, which is key on this. There are ways in a much flatter society than we used to be of doing that. Now, maybe it does help if you're at the Wilson Center or at Brookings or at USIP and not sitting in your home creating your own think tank. I mean, it gives you an immediate advantage up front. But it does. But there are lots of ways of getting it.
Actually, it's not even that, because it's about the area of plausibility. So what was my pattern? So you know, I'm stuck in bed early 2014. How the fuck do I get out? And you're right. Okay, if I put up on the web, Pete Apps takes a year back, was become executive director of the Project for Study of the 21st Century. Everyone's gonna think that's a thing. You know, that is because actually, you know what, you guys came to this event this evening because there's a logo on something on LinkedIn and a bunch of plausible sounding people. Now that's where the expertise comes in. That's where you need to be able to email the plausible sounding people and say, why don't you come and sit in my think tank? Now, the way, look, what did I do today? I emailed Alyssa Rosenberg at the Washington Post and I said, do you want to do something before I do turn in April on why everyone's into superheroes? She's going, yes, I'll do that. Right, okay, now I need a venue. Negar and I are going to have to and I could do, you know, I know how to do that. You put something on LinkedIn, you put it, you know, call it the Selee Orange. If you set up something, call it the Orange Institute, with the symbol orange circle, and hold a discussion on anything you sort of want to, and you'll find a space in DC, and you've got an interesting enough title, you will fill that room. Like, if doing a think tank in this town is so sort of easy, it's like falling off a log. In other places, it's harder because you need email addresses. The trick, the larger trick, if you want to get noticed, is to be able to email someone something that sounds plausible. The Project for Study of the 21st Century says, can I have a headline that sounds plausible, and can I get it to a journalist who has an outlook, who has an output? If you can do that, people will run your thing. I mean, the study we did last week, it's actually not that difficult. It's about identifying the key point, and what do you need to be motivated to do that? You need to be worried that no one's ever going to come see you again.
But I think getting attention may be easy, but actually making a difference may be harder, right? I mean, which is you have to know what is the difference you want to make, right? And there has to be
never ever going to know. Because actually the number of pressure. I mean, I covered this like the Civil War. There were times when I had a real effect. I'm a history major. I think study of history is based on a massive fallacy, which is that you can actually know what the hell it is that caused World War I. You can't. You don't. What the hell caused the thing that happened? Did you help stop it? I cannot tell you, and neither can Maria, whether she has made things marginally worse or marginally better on Syria, or has had no impact at all. And that's despite her really being in the room quite a lot of the time. There is no honest answer to that question. At least I don't think there ever is going to be. And the trick is to just try and be the best person you can be and have the least crap life you can.
Or you should have been a political scientist.
Yeah.
Anthropology, become anthropologists. Stop the hegemony of political science, which is there is a hegemony in think tanks of political scientists. I'm going to take the last few questions because we're running out of time together, if you don't mind. So we'll start with this gentleman.
Yes, thank you. My name is Andre Goodfriend. I'm at the Department of State now, putting together the 2016 Open Government Plan for the Department of State.
Appropriate venue then.
Yeah, it's a great place. But how governments make decisions fascinates me. And I remember back 20 years ago, the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict was looking at the early warning, early response model, which is essentially what think tanks provide, this early warning. If we could get a message out early enough, we could influence a decision. We could get a response in time for a good policy decision to be made. It's a longer discussion about why that's a flawed model. It's a propaganda model. If you speak clearly enough, you can cause someone to do something. Maybe the better model, I'm curious your thoughts about the appropriate model, would be decision support model. How do people use information? How do decision makers use information? And getting to the open government aspect of it, it's essentially what civil society is asking of government with open data. That rather than government saying, here is our policy, you should follow it, it's give us the data, give us the information in a way that we could use it so that we can aggregate it, so that we can use it to better effect. Would think tanks be better served and have more influence if they were to put their data, their information out there in a way that decision makers could access more effectively, in the same way that civil society is asking government?
Okay, we'll take the final two questions.
Okay. Thanks. Tad Daly is my name. I'm with a small think tank with an office about a block away from the United Nations called the Center for War Peace Studies. I wanted to ask you about a particular animal that directly bridges the world of academia and think tanks, because it's a PhD program at a think tank. And I'm a product of it. It's the RAND Graduate School of Policy Studies. Glad you're familiar with it. Let me just quickly tell you about it, and then I want to ask the question that never occurred to me.
Very quickly,
to ask
we're running
before.
out of
Yes,
time.
I know.
Yes.
I know. It's a work study PhD program. They let in about a dozen people a year, and you are simultaneously a staff member of the RAND Corporation working on healthcare policy, or in my case it was nuclear weapons policy, et cetera. And then you also take courses, do qualifying exams, write a dissertation, and get a PhD at the end of it. And it's been around since 1970, and the graduates go on to do a whole universe of interesting things. I'll just mention one. Arthur Brooks, one of my classmates, is the president of a big heavyweight think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. So here's the question that occurred to me. Never before did I think to ask it. It seems a fairly successful thing, but nobody else has ever done it. As far as I know, it's the only PhD program at a think tank. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that RGS model and why nobody else has done it.
Great, and then our final question in the corner.
Mine's pretty straightforward in that, and I appreciate it because I'm a big fan of American Enterprise. They have the best lunch.
That is true.
It's probably one of the first
My
places
son
that has a buffet for lunch, so.
Hear that, Peter X?
It's my vote. It's my vote. So, I don't know if this is recorded. I saw a blue light, and that's one of the first things I always like to know when I.
It's actually not. It was,
Too bad.
or is it still?
No.
It is being, it is being live streamed.
Okay, no, it's good. Because then you can look back and see, what some of the people said, and you can review them, and then maybe even use that information to your benefit. And that's why I was wondering if anyone had any. This is too much of a broad question to really tackle. But has anyone attended an event where at the end of it they actually learned something to the point where they could apply it and found that it actually changed their life or changed policy? And then are there specific times when you remember, hey, this was an epiphany. Someone said something that affected the way I think, and I took it back and I used it and made
Can I just ask, you just to say who they are and where they're from? Can you just add that quickly before we go on?
My name's Todd Wiggins, and I have a site called meetmedc.com. And since you're from the other side of the pond, I also bought the domain meetmeglobally.com.
Okay, yeah, we're having coffee at some stage.
So why don't, there were three questions. It was one about the flow of information, about the role that think tanks can play in terms of sort of getting open information to the government. The second question being about why are there not more programs that are actually trying to literally bring PhDs and think tanks together. And the third is this question about are they really changing minds, think tanks? So you can answer all three, one, and we'll just go down the row. So Maria.
That's great to have someone who's working on open government strategy. That's awesome. I think I would say, your bigger point was like make research and data accessible. And I mean, one thing that I think think tankers, academics in general could do better is to visualize their data and just make it more accessible. Because sometimes, as policymakers, you like the occasional chart and graph that you can put into a report, whatever, to strengthen PowerPoint, whatever, that you can strengthen sometimes that gives a little bit of just like, pictures can be very helpful. But I just think, writing in a way, you're more likely to read a foreign policy piece than probably something that, a very long report or monograph, perhaps. So I think there's good discipline for think tankers to, yes, produce the longer reports, but then to condense it in a way and that has sort of policy recommendations that address things that they know you're working on with OGP and the whole sort of movement for open government. And that's the way you end up writing it. So you're presenting your data in a way that's making recommendations focused on initiatives that they know you're working on. And I think, that should be the main task of think tankers and people doing research. And I don't know the answer in terms of why there aren't more RAND PhD programs. But in terms of your last point, I mean, I can just say personally, your goal, and this is a little bit of a different format for me. I'm not talking about my research, I'm talking about think tanks. But, you want any presentation or interaction with policymakers, practitioners, you want to leave at least a seed planted about how they could do their work differently and at least have a different frame on it. So like, at least that's in the back of my mind with every talk or interaction I have. When I speak on the Hill, I'm bringing activists with me. So they're hearing from activists, they're hearing me give sort of an academic frame, some research, some data, but then they're hearing from frontline activists who are involved in critically important countries that they're developing policy relations. I've made that my own personal policy. So I think, that's of course the aim with all this. If you're not trying to influence people to do things differently or to think differently, then yeah, you might as well go home and stay in that enclosed room because it otherwise, I don't know that it matters. So that's what I would say.
I would agree with Maria on that, which is, I think the experiences that I have where I learn something tends to be either something where I learn things all the time, and it's great being around lots of ideas. I mean, you're exposed to a lot of things all the time, but the things I tend to learn from either are on issues that I knew very little that I wander into, which I do periodically, or with panels of people with really different perspectives. They're coming from very different places, and they're bouncing off each other because they have very different perspectives, whatever that may be. There are a few universities out there that are, a few think tanks that have universities, but they're not in the US. There's a big one, Juventude in Brazil. There's another one in Delhi that I can't remember the name. It's an environmental think tank that also has a university. But frankly, universities in this country do a great job of doing what they do. And so I think most think tanks haven't felt, the response has been sort of public policy schools, right? I mean, bridging the divide has been, which is what RAND did before the public policy schools really existed in large scale, is they created that, and then universities actually appropriated that and did it themselves. And on open government, I mean, I can't remember the study that I'm sure a lot of people here have seen that came out a couple of years ago, the World Bank. They surveyed how many of their documents online had actually ever been used, how much of them. I mean, the World Bank is the biggest think tank in the world, right? I mean, it is hugely, fragmented. But if you would add up everything that is done in the World Bank, it is probably the largest think tank in the world. And they found some enormous, I think it was 80 or 90% of the documents had never been downloaded, never been seen by anyone. And I think for a lot of us in think tanks, that was actually a wake-up call, because I think we have a lot of things that we do. I mean, on one extreme, you have people who spend all their time networking and having coffee with influential people and, making, phone calls, and they never do any research. But for a lot of people who actually do research at think tanks, quite often I think, do the same thing that people at universities do. We sort of put it out there, we email it to everyone, we stick it on the website for 2 weeks, and then it's gone. And if you ever try and find that report again, good luck. We just went through a redesign of our website, and we have a fabulous team that does this. And one of the things they were able to do was more or less rescue, make accessible what it is. And it was one of the big motivators, make accessible what it is we have there, because a lot of stuff was just buried, to be honest with you. And it was no bad intention. I mean, on the contrary, I think we all thought we were putting stuff out there, but we never really thought of how we make sure that things actually are easily findable. And a lot of it's also then how do you get into social media? I mean, how many people get their news from Twitter, for example, or Facebook or anywhere else? I mean, frankly, people are getting their news in other ways. So it's also not just sending an email around or talking to the 5 people you think are important, but it's actually getting it out in the means that people are using today. And I'm not sure. And then repackaging repeatedly, right? So if you have something you think is important, you can't just put it out once. You can slice and dice it and put it out in 16 different ways. So with a dissertation, for example, it lends itself to
which no one will read.
Which no one will read ever. That is right.
My mom.
But they will read the op-eds from the dissertation. They will read the articles in a couple of journals. They will read the tweets and the Facebook posts that take you back to those things that have been written to the shorter forms, the two things that think tanks commission based on the dissertation. I mean, everything we do, you know, in some ways it's not just producing a product, it is producing sort of multiple products and then making sure that it's accessible to people that can use it. You know.
No, I was going to say, I spend, when I'm targeting the PhD does, I spend kind of time looking at what people look at on the web. My instinct is that for man hour on man hour, you reach more people through actual discussions. Yes, I've had a whole bunch of epiphanies, small and large, listening to bright people discuss stuff. There's a reason why, actually, I hadn't thought about this quite so viscerally. I decided that if I was going to only be up for a handful of hours a week, I was going to design something that would mean I would maximize my chances of spending those discussions with as many good people, and that means you get more from time, and it's scalable, but I think you get more often out of an hour with 3 good people than you do out of 3 30-minute periods with 1 good person, if they're good. It's made me very unforgiving of meetings and people that waste my time. Partly because you're not entirely right. There is a third space between being locked in a room and meeting good people, and it's being outside and interacting with the world. And sometimes I sit in events in this town and I just think, fuck you, I could have been sitting in the sun. Because actually those are the, and the fourth element would be kind of interacting with people you care about.
How do you know I'm not having my meetings with people in the sun?
I may love sun. I'll be honest, if you're not, you're missing a trick. No, I mean, yes, no, sorry. I mean, no, once it gets nice, sorry. I mean, why the hell would you do a meeting on a roof when you can do, when you don't have to? Finally, to your point, I mean, I think it's a lot of it about government. Government has never changed that much. There is a king or there is a chief. He has to make a decision. It's really important. He has a limited number of hours in the day. He has people who surround him. You can hack that process. Google, I think, is your friend. Obama, we know, spends quite a bit of time Googling stuff. So when he says, what the hell are about Syria, he just presumably does the same as anyone else does and goes, I want people, and puts some search terms in. That actually is, if you've got a well-written thing, yes, no one will read Negar's piece. If Negar turns it into a book or says, what are think tanks for, people will read it. A lot of it's in the headline. A lot of it's in being able to be found at the top end of things. A lot of it's crafting the right title for a discussion. I think we made a slight mistake earlier on. What think tanks do, it should be what they contribute. Those things just kind of broaden the number of people you get in. But I think, again, it's. I finished with the one really useful thing I heard. It's probably the most useful thing I've ever heard in a discussion was actually the chief of the air staff, whose name temporarily escapes me, was asked what advice you would give his kid. Someone would give a kid, someone who just joined the Air Force. He said, don't too many people in this town worry about their reputation, worry about your character. If you get the character right, your reputation will look after itself. I thought that was really, really good. I bet he stole it from someone else. I bet he heard it in discussion sometime. That's good. On the brand thing, I think anything that exists that is unique and does something, whether it's PhD programs or think tanks or contractors or whatever, is good because it broadens it. If it doesn't exist but you think it should, then it's worth building it because it'll probably serve some useful function.
Great. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you all for coming.